The telegram arrived at the Biberach family home in St. Helier, Jersey on September 14, 1942. It was brief and bureaucratic, giving them 48 hours to prepare for deportation to Germany. Marie Biberach read it 3 times before the words fully registered. She looked at her 3 children, 12-year-old Jean, 10-year-old Claude, and 8-year-old Sophie, playing in the garden, unaware that their world was about to collapse. The telegram explained that because Marie had been born in England rather than Jersey, she and her children qualified for deportation under Hitler's new directive. Her husband, Pierre, a Jersey native, would remain behind. The family had 2 days to decide what could fit in a single suitcase each before being taken to an internment camp in Germany. They would be among 2,300 Channel Islanders deported in retaliation for Britain's internment of German civilians in Persia, modern-day Iran. These British citizens, including hundreds of children, would spend the next 3 years as civilian prisoners of war on German soil. The Channel Islands had fallen to German occupation in June 1940, the only British territory conquered by Nazi forces during World War II. The islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, and Sark, sat just miles from the French coast, indefensible after the fall of France in the evacuation at Dunkirk. The British government made the painful decision to demilitarize the islands, leaving them to their fate. When German forces arrived on June 30, 1940, they encountered no resistance, walking onto British soil without firing a shot. For the roughly 66,000 islanders who chose to remain, nearly half the pre-war population having already evacuated, occupation meant living under Nazi rule while technically remaining British citizens. It was a unique and terrible situation, creating ambiguities and complications that would haunt the islands for decades. The first 2 years of occupation were difficult but not catastrophic. The Germans imposed their laws, confiscated radios, instituted curfews, and requisitioned supplies. But life continued with a semblance of normalcy. Schools remained open, though now teaching German language. Shops operated under restrictions. Families tried to maintain routines despite the presence of thousands of German soldiers. The children of the islands grew up seeing Wehrmacht uniforms on every street corner, learning to recognize the different insignias and ranks, hearing German commands echo through town squares. They became fluent in the vocabulary of occupation, words like verboten and Ausweis entering their daily language. It was an abnormal childhood made to seem normal through sheer necessity. Then came the deportations. In September 1942, Hitler personally ordered the internment of Channel Islanders in retaliation for British actions in Persia, modern-day Iran. The British had interned German civilians there to protect oil interests, and Hitler demanded reciprocal action. The order initially called for deporting anyone not born on the islands, as well as former British military officers from World War I. The ratio was calculated: 20 islanders for every German interned. The German authorities compiled lists, cross-referencing birth records and residence documentation. Families received telegrams giving them hours or at most days to prepare for indefinite detention in Germany. The impact on children was devastating. Some families were split apart, with island-born fathers staying behind while English-born mothers were deported with their children. Other children were separated from parents entirely, sent to live with relatives or neighbors when their parents fell under deportation orders. Still others faced impossible choices. 13-year-old Robert Biberach from Guernsey watched his mother decide whether to leave him with his grandparents or bring him into captivity. She chose captivity, reasoning that whatever lay ahead, they should face it together. They had no way of knowing they would spend the next 3 years in German internment camps. The deportation process itself was traumatic. Families assembled at collection points with their meager belongings, 1 suitcase per person containing everything they hoped might sustain them through indefinite imprisonment. German soldiers inspected the luggage, confiscating items deemed contraband or unnecessary. Children clutched dolls and favorite books, only to have them thrown aside by guards who saw such items as wasteful uses of space. The deportees were loaded onto boats for the crossing to France, then transferred to trains that would carry them deep into Germany. The journey took days. The deportees packed into cattle cars or third-class carriages, uncertainty hanging over them like a shroud. The first stop for most deportees was Dorsten, a transit camp in northwestern Germany. The conditions shocked the islanders. The camp was filthy, overcrowded, infested with lice and other vermin. Families were separated by gender, with women and children assigned to one section and men to another. The children, many of whom had never been away from their fathers before, found themselves in a strange and hostile environment where their fathers existed somewhere on the other side of a fence, but might as well have been on another planet. The transit camp was temporary, a holding area while German authorities decided on permanent placement, but the weeks spent there introduced the children to the reality of their new existence. They were prisoners, subject to guards, rules, and conditions designed not for their comfort, but for their containment. The permanent camps were Biberach and Laufen in southern Germany, and Wurzach. These facilities, former military barracks and prisoner of war camps, became home to the Channel Islanders' deportees for the duration of their captivity. Biberach, designated Ilog 5B, held the largest number, including most of the women and children from Guernsey and some from Jersey. The camp sat in the countryside near the town of Biberach an der Riss, a collection of long wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. When Marie Vibert and her children arrived in October 1942, after weeks of travel and temporary detention, they stared at the facility that would be their home and wondered how they would survive. The accommodations were primitive. Large rooms designed to house a dozen soldiers now contained 40 or 50 women and children. Triple-tier bunk beds lined the walls, leaving narrow aisles between them. Privacy was non-existent. Families claimed whatever space they could, marking their territory with the few possessions they had brought. Marie Vibert secured bunks for her children near a window, reasoning that fresh air would be essential through the coming months. She did not yet know she would spend 3 winters in this room, watching her children grow and change in ways no child should ever have to experience. The children of Biberach ranged from infants to teenagers. Some, like Sophie Vibert, were young enough to adapt with the resilience of childhood, finding ways to play even in the most constrained circumstances. Others, like her brother Jean, on the cusp of adolescence, struggled with the disruption of critical developmental years. They attended makeshift schools organized by internee teachers, learning lessons interrupted by roll calls, hunger, and the constant awareness that they were prisoners. The camp authorities provided minimal supplies, so teachers improvised, creating textbooks from memory, fashioning writing materials from scraps, using every resource at their disposal to maintain some semblance of education. Food dominated every thought and conversation. The German rations were deliberately inadequate, calculated to keep prisoners alive but weakened. The children received thin soup made from turnips or potatoes, a small portion of dark bread, and occasionally a bit of margarine or ersatz sausage. It was never enough. The growing children felt hunger constantly, their bodies demanding more than the rations could provide. They learned to eat slowly, to savor every bite, to never waste even a crumb. They learned what real hunger felt like, the gnawing emptiness that makes it difficult to concentrate, to sleep, to think about anything except the next meal. The Red Cross became a lifeline. Packages sent by the International Committee of the Red Cross contained food, clothing, and small comforts that made survival possible. Each package was treasure, containing items like chocolate, tinned meat, powdered milk, and soap that seemed impossibly luxurious in the context of life in camp. The children learned to make packages last, rationing the contents carefully, trading items with other families to obtain what they needed most. A tin of sardines might be worth a bar of soap. A package of tea could be exchanged for warm socks. This informal economy, driven by necessity, became part of daily life. Winter in southern Germany was brutal for people accustomed to the mild climate of the Channel Islands. The barracks were poorly heated, with a single stove in each room that provided minimal warmth when fuel was available, which was not often. The children learned to sleep wearing every piece of clothing they owned, huddled together for warmth under thin blankets. Frostbite was common, as were respiratory infections that spread rapidly through the crowded quarters. The camp hospital, staffed by internee doctors and nurses, did what it could with almost nothing. Children died from pneumonia, from complications of malnutrition, from diseases that would have been easily treated in normal circumstances. Yet the children also showed remarkable resilience. They created their own world within the camp, a children's society that operated parallel to the adult community. They organized games and competitions, put on plays and concerts, celebrated birthdays and holidays with whatever materials they could scrounge. The teenagers formed clubs, held debates, created camp newspapers written in hand and passed from barrack to barrack. These activities were more than entertainment. They were survival mechanisms, ways of maintaining identity and purpose when everything else had been stripped away. The deportees organized themselves with British efficiency, appointing camp leaders and establishing systems for distributing resources, resolving disputes, and maintaining morale. At Biberach, the internees elected a camp captain who served as liaison with the German authorities and represented the interests of the prisoners. They established committees for education, recreation, and welfare, creating structure in an environment designed to be structureless. For the children, this organization provided a sense that adults were still in control, that there was order even in captivity. It was a comforting fiction that helped them cope with the reality of powerlessness. Communication with the outside world was limited and heavily censored. Internees could send postcards to relatives, but the messages had to be brief and could not contain any information about camp conditions that might reflect poorly on German treatment of prisoners. The children learned to write in code, using seemingly innocent phrases that family members would understand carried hidden meanings. A comment about the weather might indicate food shortages. A mention of missing someone might signal illness. These coded messages became a form of resistance, a way of telling the truth despite censorship. The psychological toll on children was profound. They witnessed their parents struggle with depression and anxiety, saw the fear in adult eyes even when mouths smiled reassuringly. They absorbed the tension and uncertainty, processing it through the limited emotional tools available to children. Some became withdrawn and quiet, retreating into themselves. Others acted out, their behavior reflecting trauma they could not articulate. All of them were forced to grow up faster than they should have, learning lessons about human cruelty and resilience that no childhood curriculum should include. Claude Vibert celebrated his 11th, 12th, and 13th birthdays in Biberach. Each year his mother tried to make the day special, saving rations to create something resembling a cake, gathering other children to sing. But the celebrations were bittersweet, marking time in captivity, measuring childhood lost. Claude watched other boys his age, free boys in the world outside the wire, and wondered what his life would have been if not for a telegram and a decision made by Hitler that had nothing to do with him or his family. He was not a soldier, had committed no crime, represented no threat. He was simply collateral damage in a larger conflict, a child whose British birth made him useful as a bargaining chip in geopolitical calculations. Disease was a constant threat in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery swept through the camp regularly, leaving children dehydrated and weak. Typhus, scarlet fever, and other infectious diseases found fertile ground among malnourished prisoners living in close quarters. The children learned to recognize symptoms, to fear the isolation ward where the sickest patients were quarantined. They watched friends disappear into that ward and sometimes not return. Death became familiar in ways that haunt childhood innocence. In 1943,
A second wave of deportations brought new prisoners to the camps, including more children. These deportees included former World War I officers, people the Germans classified as undesirables, and those suspected of resistance activities. The new arrivals brought fresh horror stories from the islands, tales of increasing hardship, tightening restrictions, and growing desperation as food supplies dwindled. For the children already in the camps, hearing about their homes deteriorating while they remained trapped in Germany added another layer of anguish. The children formed deep friendships in the camps, bonds forged in shared adversity that would last lifetimes. Sophie Biberach became inseparable from another girl her age, Beatrice from Jersey, and they created elaborate imaginary worlds to escape the grim reality around them. They spent hours telling stories, describing the homes they would have when the war ended, planning futures that seemed impossibly distant. These friendships provided emotional sustenance as important as the physical sustenance of Red Cross packages. The deportees engaged in subtle acts of resistance that boosted morale even when they accomplished nothing tangible. The V for Victory campaign that spread across occupied Europe reached the camps. Internees incorporated the V symbol into art and crafts, embroidered it into clothing, carved it into wood. One woman made shoes with soles that left V-shaped footprints in the dirt. A man trimmed his beard into a V shape. These small defiances meant everything to people stripped of agency, proof that their spirits remained unbroken even when their bodies were imprisoned. Education took on enormous importance. Parents and teachers understood that the children's intellectual development could not stop just because they were in camps. Classes continued despite the lack of materials, with subjects ranging from mathematics to languages to history. Some children learned German from guards, turning enemy presence into opportunity. Others studied subjects like Latin or advanced mathematics that they would have been unavailable to them in their island schools. Education became an act of faith in the future, an assertion that these children would one day leave the camps and need the knowledge to rebuild their lives.
As 1944 progressed and news of Allied advances filtered into the camps, hope began to cautiously grow. The D-Day landings in June brought excitement and speculation. Surely liberation could not be far off. But the Channel Islands were bypassed by the invasion, left in German hands as Allied forces drove deeper into France. The deportees in Germany remained in captivity, their hopes dashed, forced to endure more months of imprisonment, while liberation swept past their homes without freeing them. The final winter of 1944-1945 was the hardest. Food supplies in Germany were collapsing under the pressure of Allied bombing and advancing armies. The internment camps, low priority in the German supply system, received almost nothing. The deportees survived on what Red Cross packages could provide. But even those shipments became irregular as transportation networks failed. The children, already malnourished, grew thinner, their growth stunted, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. Parents watched in agony as their children wasted away, powerless to provide the nutrition desperate young bodies needed. Liberation came in April 1945, as French forces advanced through southern Germany. The guards at Biberach, seeing the inevitability of German defeat, became less hostile, some even friendly in their desperation to demonstrate they had treated prisoners well. When French soldiers arrived at the camp gates, the scene was subdued rather than celebratory. The deportees were too weak, too traumatized, too uncertain about what came next to truly rejoice. They had survived, but survival had cost them years they could never recover. The return to the Channel Islands was complicated and slow. The islands themselves were starving, having been cut off from supplies through the final months of occupation. The infrastructure was damaged, the economy destroyed. The deportees arrived home to find houses occupied by others, possessions gone, lives impossible to resume where they had left off. For the children, the return was disorienting.
They had left as younger versions of themselves and returned as strangers, shaped by experiences their island peers could not understand. The psychological damage manifested in various ways. Some children struggled academically, the years of interrupted education leaving gaps difficult to fill. Others had trouble forming relationships, their trust broken by years of captivity. Many carried nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety that would persist for decades. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not yet exist, and the mental health support they desperately needed was not available. They were expected to move on, to be grateful for survival, to not complain about experiences that were now in the past. Jean Weber, who had been 12 when deported and 15 at liberation, found himself unable to relate to peers who had remained on Jersey. They had suffered under occupation, certainly, but their experiences were fundamentally different from his. He had been imprisoned in Germany, had known real hunger, had watched people die in internment camps. His childhood friends could not comprehend this, and he lacked the vocabulary to explain. He retreated into silence, carrying his trauma alone because sharing seemed impossible. The financial impact on families was severe. They had lost 3 years of income, returned to homes stripped of valuables, faced bills and debts accumulated during their absence. Many never recovered economically, spending the rest of their lives struggling with poverty. The British government provided minimal compensation, a sum so inadequate it seemed insulting compared to what had been taken. The children watched their parents age prematurely under the weight of financial stress, layered atop emotional trauma. The islands themselves struggled to come to terms with the occupation and deportations. There was shame and guilt about collaboration, about how the island governments had worked with German authorities. There were accusations that some had profited from the occupation while others suffered. The deportees found themselves in an uncomfortable position, their suffering acknowledged, but their stories not always welcomed in a community trying to move forward. Some were accused of exaggerating their experiences or seeking special treatment. The complexity of victimhood under occupation created divisions that took generations to heal. For decades, the deportation of Channel Islanders received little attention in broader narratives of World War II. British historians focused on the Battle of Britain, Dunkirk, and the eventual victory. The occupation of the Channel Islands was a footnote, and the deportations within that footnote barely merited mention. The children who had been prisoners of war on German soil found their experiences erased from public memory, their suffering invisible in the triumphant narrative of British resistance and victory.
It was not until the 21st century that serious historical research began documenting the experiences of Channel Islands deportees. Academics like Dr. Gilly Carr at Cambridge University undertook extensive work to recover these lost stories, interviewing surviving deportees, researching archives in multiple countries, and ensuring that the experiences of people like the Biberach family were finally recorded and acknowledged. This research revealed that the deportees had been sent to over 120 different camps and prisons across occupied Europe, that their experiences were far more varied and often more brutal than previously understood. The children who survived the camps carried their experiences throughout their lives. They raised families of their own, often overprotective, unable to shake the fear that safety could be stripped away without warning. They hoarded food compulsively, unable to trust that provisions would continue. They struggled with intimacy and trust, the psychological walls built during captivity never fully dismantled. Yet many also showed remarkable resilience, building successful lives despite their trauma, finding ways to channel their pain into purpose. Sophie Weibert, the youngest of the 3 siblings, later said that her clearest memories of childhood were not of Jersey before deportation, but of Biberach. The camp was where she learned to read, where she celebrated her 9th, 10th, and 11th birthdays, where she became who she was. The experience shaped her completely, leaving her with both wounds and strengths. She spent her adult life advocating for recognition of Channel Islands deportees,
ensuring that younger generations understood what had happened to ordinary British citizens during the war. As the survivors aged and their numbers dwindled, memorials were finally erected. In Biberach, the German town that had hosted the internment camp, a plaque was placed remembering the Channel Islanders held there. In Guernsey and Jersey, monuments honor the deportees, many of whom died in captivity or shortly after liberation. These memorials came late, too late for many survivors to see their suffering officially acknowledged, but they serve as promises that the stories will not be forgotten, that the children who were prisoners of war on British soil and in German camps will be remembered. The story of Channel Islands child deportees is one of ordinary families caught in extraordinary circumstances, of childhoods stolen by geopolitical calculations, of resilience in the face of systematic cruelty. These British children, guilty of nothing except being born in the wrong place or to the wrong parents, spent formative years behind barbed wire, learning lessons about human nature that no child should have to learn. Their experiences challenge simple narratives of World War II, reminding us that suffering and victimhood took many forms, that not all prisoners were soldiers, and that the costs of war are often borne by those least able to shoulder them. The children who were deported from the Channel Islands and imprisoned in Germany were prisoners of war in every meaningful sense, and their stories deserve to be told, remembered, and honored as part of the full accounting of what the war cost and who paid its price.